Section 15 of How They Succeeded. How They Succeeded by Orison Swett Marden. Section 15. A Fascinating Story by General Lew Wallace. In his study, a curiously shaped building lighted from the top and combining in equal portions the Byzantine, Romanesque, and Doric styles of architecture, the gray-haired author of Ben-Hur, surrounded by his pictures, books, and military trophies, is spending in serene and comfortable retirement the evening of his life. As I sat beside him the other day, and listened to the recital of his earlier struggles and later achievements, I could not help contrasting his dignified bearing, careful expression, and gentle demeanor with another occasion in his life, when, as a vigorous, black-haired young military officer in the spring of 1861, he appeared, with flashing eye and uplifted sword, at the head of his regiment, the gallant and historic 11th Indiana Volunteers. General Wallace never repels a visitor, and his greeting is cordial and ingenuous. "If I could say anything to stimulate or encourage the young men of today," he said, "I would gladly do so, but I fear that the story of my early days would be of very little interest or value to others. So far as school education is concerned, it may be truthfully said that I had but little, if any, and if, in spite of that deficiency, I ever arrived at proficiency, I reached it, I presume, as Topsy attained her stature, just growed into it." A boyhood of wasted opportunities. "Were you denied early school advantages?" I asked. "Not in the least. On the contrary, I had most abundant opportunity in that respect. My father was a lawyer, enjoying a lucrative practice in Brookville, Indiana, a small town which bears the distinction of having given to the world more prominent men than any other place in the Hoosier state. Not long after my birth, he was elected lieutenant governor, and finally, governor of the state. He, himself, was an educated man, having been graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point, and having served as instructor in mathematics there. He was not only an educated man, but a man of advanced ideas generally, as shown by the fact that he failed of re-election to Congress in 1840, because, as a member of the Committee on Commerce, he gave the casting vote in favor of an appropriation to develop Morse's magnetic telegraph. Of course, he believed in the value, and tried to impress upon me the necessity of a thorough school training, but in the face of all the solicitude and encouragement which an indulgent father could waste on an unappreciative son, I remained vexatiously indifferent. I presume I was like some man in history. It was Lincoln, I believe, who said that his father taught him to work, but he never quite succeeded in teaching him to love it. My father sent me to school, and regularly paid tuition, for in those days there were no free schools. But, much to my discredit, he failed to secure anything like regular attendance at recitations, or even a decent attempt to master my lessons at any time. In fact, much of the time that should have been given to school was spent in fishing, hunting, and roaming through the woods. His boyhood love for history and literature. But were you thus indifferent to all forms of education? No, my case was not quite so hopeless as that. I did not desert the school entirely, but my attendance was so provokingly irregular, and my indifference so supreme, I wonder now that I was tolerated at all. But I had one mainstay. I loved to read. I was a most inordinate reader. In some lines of literature, especially history and kinds of fiction, my appetite was insatiate. And many a day, while my companions were clustered together in the old red brick schoolhouse, struggling with their problems in fractions or percentage, I was carefully hidden in the woods nearby, lying upon my elbows, munching on an apple, and reveling in the beauties of Plutarch, Byron, or Goldsmith. Did you not attend college or the higher grade of schools? Yes, for a brief period. My brother was a student in Wabash College, here in Crawfordsville, and hither I also was sent. But within 6 weeks I had tired of the routine, was satiated with discipline, and made my exit from the institution. I shall never forget what my father did when I returned home. He called me into his office, and reaching into one of the pigeonholes above his desk, withdrew therefrom a package of papers neatly folded and tied with the conventional red tape. He was a very systematic man, due, perhaps, to his West Point training, and these papers proved to be the receipts for my tuition, which he had carefully preserved. He called off the items and asked me to add them together. The total, I confess, staggered me. A father's fruitful warning. "That sum, my son," he said with a tone of regret in his voice, "represents what I have expended in these many years past to provide you with a good education. How successful I have been, you know better than anyone else. After mature reflection, I have come to the conclusion that I have done for you in that direction all that can reasonably be expected of any parent, and I have, therefore, called you in to tell you that you have now reached an age when you must take up the lines yourself. If you have failed to profit by the advantages with which I have tried so hard to surround you, the responsibility must be yours. I shall not upbraid you for your neglect, but rather pity you for the indifference which you have shown to the golden opportunities you have, through my indulgence, been enabled to enjoy. A manhood of splendid effort." What effect did admonition have on you? Did it awaken or arouse you? It aroused me, most assuredly. It set me to thinking as nothing before had done. The next day I set out with a determination to accomplish something for myself. My father's injunction rang in my ears. New responsibilities rested on my shoulders, as I was, for the first time in my life, my own master. I felt that I must get work on my own account. After much effort, I finally obtained employment from the man with whom I had passed so many afternoons strolling up and down the little streams in the neighborhood, trying to fish. He was the county clerk, and he hired me to copy what was known as the complete record of one of the courts. I worked for months in a dingy, half-lighted room, receiving for my pay something like 10 cents per 100 words. The tedious and the regularity of the work was a splendid drill for me, and taught me the virtue of persistence as one of the avenues of success. It was at this time I began to realize the deficiency in my education, especially as I had an ambition to become a lawyer. Being deficient in both mathematics and grammar, I was forced to study evenings. Of course, the latter was a very exacting study, after a full day's hard work. But I was made to realize that the time I had spent with such lavish prodigality could not be recovered, and that I must extract every possible good out of the golden moments then flying by all too fast. Self-education by reading and literary composition. Had you a distinct literary ambition at that time? Well, I had always had a sort of literary bent or inclination. I read all the literature of the day, besides the standard authors, and finally began to devote my odd moments to a book of my own, a tale based on the days of the Crusades. When completed, it covered about 350 pages, and bore the rather high-sounding title, The Man at Arms. I read a good portion of it before a literary society to which I belonged. The members applauded it, and I was frequently urged to have it published. The Mexican War soon followed, however, and I took the manuscript with me when I enlisted. But before the close of my service it was lost, and my production, therefore, never reached the public eye. But did not the approval which the book received from the few persons who read it encourage you to continue writing? Full 50 years have elapsed since then, and it is, therefore, rather difficult at this late day to recall just how such things affected me. I suppose I was encouraged thereby, for in due course of time another book which turned out to be The Fair God, my first book to reach the public, began to shape itself in my mind. The composition of this work was not, as the theatrical people would say, a continuous performance, for there were many and singular interruptions, and it would be safe to say that months, and in one case years, intervened between certain chapters. A few years after the war, I finished the composition, strung the chapters into a continuous narrative, leveled up the uneven places, and started east with the manuscript. A letter from Whitelaw Reid, then editor of the New York Tribune, introduced me to the head of one of the leading publishing houses in Boston. There I was kindly received and delivered my manuscript, which was referred to a professional reader to determine its literary and also, I presume, its commercial value. It would be neither a new nor an interesting story to acquaint the public with the degree of anxious suspense that pervaded my mind when I withdrew to await the reader's judgment. Every other writer has, I assume, at one time or another, undergone much the same experience. It was not long until I learned from the publisher that the reader reported in favor of my production. Publication soon followed, and for the first time, in a literary sense, I found myself before the public, and my book before the critics. The Origin of Ben-Hur. How long after this did Ben-Hur appear, and what led you to write it? I began Ben-Hur about 1876 and was published in 1880. The purpose, at first, was a short serial for one of the magazines, descriptive of the visit of the wise men to Jerusalem as mentioned in the first 2 verses of the 2nd chapter of Matthew. It will be recognized in Book 1st of the work as now published. For certain reasons, however, the serial idea was abandoned, and the narrative, instead of ending with the birth of the Savior, expanded into a more pretentious novel and only ended with the death scene on Calvary. The last 10 chapters were written in the old adobe palace at Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I was serving as a governor. It is difficult to answer the questions, what led me to write the book, or why I chose a piece of fiction which used Christ as its leading character. In explanation, it is proper to state that I had reached an age in life when men usually begin to study themselves with reference to their fellowmen and reflect on the good they may have done in the world. Up to that time, never having read the Bible, I knew nothing about sacred history, and, in matters of a religious nature, although I was not in every respect an infidel, I was persistently and notoriously indifferent. I did not know, and therefore did not care. I resolved to begin the study of the good book in earnest. Influence of the story of the Christ upon the author. I was in quest of knowledge, but I had no faith to sustain, no creed to bolster up. The result was that the whole field of religious and biblical history opened up before me, and my vision not being clouded by previously formed opinions, I was enabled to survey it without the aid of lenses. I believe I was thorough and persistent. I know I was conscientious in my search for the truth. I weighed, I analyzed, I counted and compared. The evolution from conjecture into knowledge, through opinion and belief, was gradual but irresistible, and at length I stood firmly and defiantly on the solid rock. Upward of 700,000 copies of Ben-Hur have been published, and it has been translated into all languages, from French to Arabic. But, whether it has ever influenced the mind of a single reader or not, I am sure its conception and preparation, if it has done nothing more, have convinced its author of the divinity of the lowly Nazarene who walked and talked with God. End of section 15.
Chapter 16 of How They Succeeded. How They Succeeded by Orison Swett Marden. Section 16. Carnegie as a Metal Worker. "There is no doubt," said Mr. Carnegie, in reply to a question from me, "that it is becoming harder and harder as business gravitates more and more to immense concerns, for a young man without capital to get a start for himself, and in the large cities it is especially so, where large capital is essential. Still, it can be honestly said that there is no other country in the world where able and energetic young men and women can so readily rise as in this. A president of a business college informed me recently that he has never been able to supply the demand for capable, first-class, mark the adjective, bookkeepers, and his college has over 900 students. In America, young men of ability rise with most astonishing rapidity. As quickly as when you were a boy? Much more so. When I was a boy, there were but very few important positions that a boy could aspire to. Every position had to be made. Now a boy doesn't need to make the place. All he has to do is fit himself to take it. Early works and wages. Where did you begin life? In Dunfermline, Scotland. During my earliest years, the service of my life has all been in this country. In Pittsburgh? Largely so. My father settled in Allegheny City when I was only 10 years old, and I began to earn my way in Pittsburgh. Do you mind telling me what your first service was? Not at all. I was a bobbin boy in a cotton factory, then an engine man or boy in the same place, and later still I was a messenger boy for a telegraph company. At small wages, I suppose. $1.20 a week was what I was receiving as a bobbin boy, and I considered it pretty good at that. When I was 13, I had learned to run a steam engine, and for that I received $1.80 a week. You had no early schooling then? None except such as I gave myself. Colonel Anderson's books. There were no fine libraries then, but in Allegheny City, where I lived, there was a certain Colonel Anderson, who was well-to-do and of a philanthropic turn. He announced, about the time I first began to work, that he would be in his library at home every Saturday, ready to lend books to working boys and men. He had only about 400 volumes, but I doubt if ever so few books were put to better use. Only he who has longed, as I did for Saturday to come, that the spring of knowledge might be opened anew to him, can understand what Colonel Anderson did for me and others of the boys of Allegheny. Quite a number of them have risen to eminence, and I think their rise can be easily traced to this splendid opportunity. Open footnote. It was Colonel Anderson's kindness that led Carnegie to bestow his wealth so generously for founding libraries, as he is now doing every year. Close footnote. His first glimpse of paradise. How long did you remain an engine boy? Not very long, Mr. Carnegie replied, perhaps a year. And then I entered a telegraph office as a messenger boy. Although Mr. Carnegie did not dwell much on this period, he once described it at a dinner given in honor of the American consul at Dunfermline, Scotland, when he said, "I awake from a dream that has carried me away back to the days of my boyhood, the day when the little white-haired Scottish laddie, dressed in a blue jacket, walked with his father into the telegraph office in Pittsburgh to undergo examination as an applicant for a position as a messenger boy. Well, I remember when my uncle spoke to my parents about it, and my father objected, because I was getting $1.80 per week for running the small engine in the cellar in Allegheny City. But my uncle said a messenger's wages would be $2.50. If you want an idea as to heaven on earth, imagine what it is to be taken from a dark cellar where I fired the boiler from morning until night and dropped into an office where light shone from all sides, with books, papers, and pencils in profusion around me, and oh, the tick of those mysterious brass instruments on the desk, annihilating space and conveying intelligence to the world. This was my first glimpse of paradise, and I walked on air. How did you manage to rise from this position? I learned how to operate a telegraph instrument, and then waited an opportunity to show that I was fit to be an operator. Eventually, my chance came. The truth is that James D. Reed, the superintendent of the office, and himself a Scotchman, favored the ambitious lad. In his History of the Telegraph, he says of him, "I liked the boy's looks, and it was easy to see that though he was little, he was full of spirit. He had not been with me a month when he asked me to teach him to telegraph. He spent all his spare time in practice, sending and receiving by sound and not by tape, as was the custom in those days. Pretty soon he could do as well as I could at the key." Introduced to a broom. As you look back upon it, I said to Mr. Carnegie, do you consider that so lowly a beginning is better than one a little less trying? For young men starting upon their life work, it is much the best to begin as I did, at the beginning, and occupy the most subordinate positions. Many of the present-day leading men of Pittsburgh had serious responsibility thrust upon them at the very threshold of their careers. They were introduced to the broom and spent the first hours of their business life sweeping out the office. I notice we have janitors and janitresses now in offices, and our young men, unfortunately, miss that salutary branch of early education. It does not hurt the newest comer to sweep out the office. Did you? Many's the time. And who do you suppose were my fellow sweepers? David McBargo, afterwards superintendent of the Allegheny Valley Railroad; Robert Pitcairn, afterwards superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad; and Mr. Moreland, subsequently city attorney of Pittsburgh. We all took turns, 2 each morning, doing the sweeping, and now I remember Davy was so proud of his clean shirt bosom that he used to spread over it an old silk handkerchief which he kept for the purpose, and we other boys thought he was putting on airs. So he was. None of us had a silk handkerchief. After you had learned to telegraph, did you consider that you had reached high enough? Just at that time my father died, and the burden of the support of the family fell upon me. I earned as an operator $25 a month, and a little additional money by copying telegraphic messages for the newspapers, and managed to keep the family independent. An expert telegrapher. More light on this period of Mr. Carnegie's career is given by The Electric Age, which says, as a telegraph operator, he was abreast of older and experienced men, and although receiving messages by sound was at that time forbidden by authority as being unsafe, young Carnegie quickly acquired the art, and he can still stand behind the ticker and understand its language. As an operator, he delighted in full employment and the prompt discharge of business, and a big day's work was his chief pleasure. How long did you remain at the telegraph company? Until I was given a place by the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. As an operator? At first, until I showed how the telegraph could minister to railroad safety and success. Then I was made a secretary to Thomas A. Scott, the superintendent, and not long afterwards, when Colonel Scott became vice president, I was made superintendent of the Western Division. Colonel Scott's attention was drawn to Carnegie by the operators devising a plan for running trains by telegraph, so making the most of a single track. Up to this time, no one had ever dreamed of running trains in opposite directions towards each other, directing them by telegraph, one train being sidetracked while the other passed. The boys studied out a train dispatching system which was afterwards used on every single-track railroad in the country. Nobody had ever thought of this before, and the officials were so pleased with the ingenious lad that they placed him in charge of a division office, and before he was 20, made him superintendent of the Western Division of the road. What employers think of young men. Concerning this period of his life, I asked Mr. Carnegie if his promotion was not a matter of chance, and whether he did not, at the time, feel it to be so. His answer was emphatic. Never. Young men give all kinds of reasons why, in their cases, failure is attributable to exceptional circumstances which rendered success impossible. Some never had a chance, according to their own story. This is simply nonsense. No young man ever lived who had not a chance, and a splendid chance, too, if he was ever employed at all. He is assayed in the mind of his immediate superior from the day he begins work, and after a time, if he has merit, he is assayed in the council chambers of the firm. His ability, honesty, habits, associations, temper, disposition, all these are weighed and analyzed. The young man who never had a chance is the same young man who has been canvassed over and over again by his superiors and found destitute of necessary qualifications, or is deemed unworthy of closer relations with the firm owing to some objectionable act, habit, or association of which he thought his employers ignorant. It sounds true. It is. The right men in demand. Another class of young men attributes failure to rise to employers having near relatives or favorites whom they advance unfairly. They also insist that their employers dislike brighter intelligences than their own, and are disposed to discourage aspiring genius, and delighted in keeping young men down. There is nothing in this. On the contrary, there is no one suffering more for lack of the right man in the right place as the average employer, nor anyone more anxious to find him. Was this your theory on the subject when you began working for the railroad company? I had no theory then, although I have formulated one since. It lies mainly in this: instead of the question, "What must I do for my employer?" substitute, "What can I do?" Faithful and conscientious discharge of duties assigned to you is all very well, but the verdict in such cases generally is that you perform your present duties so well that you would better continue performing them. Now this will not do. It will not do for the coming partners. There must be something beyond this. We make clerks, bookkeepers, treasurers, bank tellers of this class, and there they remain to the end of the chapter. The rising man must do something exceptional, and beyond the range of his special department. He must attract attention. How to attract attention? How can he do that? Well, if he is a shipping clerk, he may do so by discovering in an invoice an error with which he has nothing to do and which has escaped the attention of the proper party. If a weighing clerk, he may save for the firm in questioning the adjustment of the scales and having them corrected, even if this be the province of the master mechanic. If a messenger boy, he can lay the seed of promotion by going beyond the letter of his instructions in order to secure the desired reply. There is no service so low and simple, neither any so high, in which the young man of ability and willing disposition cannot readily and almost daily prove himself capable of greater trust and usefulness, and, what is equally important, show his invincible determination to rise. In what manner did you reach out to establish your present great fortune? I asked. By saving my money. I put a little money aside, and it served me later as a matter of credit. Also, I invested in a sleeping car industry, which paid me well. Sleeping car invention. Although I tried earnestly to get the great Iron King to talk of this, he said little, because the matter has been fully dealt with by him in his Triumphant Democracy. From his own story there, it appears that one day at this time, when Mr. Carnegie still had his fortune to make, he was on a train examining the line from a rear window of a car, when a tall, spare man accosted him and asked him to look at an invention he had made. He drew from a green bag a small model of a sleeping berth for railway cars, and proceeded to point out its advantages. It was Mr. T. Woodruff, the inventor of the sleeping car. As Mr. Carnegie tells the story, he had not spoken a moment before, like a flash, the whole range of the discovery burst upon me. "Yes," I said, "that is something which this continent must have." Upon my return, I laid it before Mr. Scott, declaring that it was one of the inventions of the age. He remarked, "You are an enthusiastic young man, but you may ask the inventor to come and let me see it." I did so, and arrangements were made to build 2 trial cars and run them on the Pennsylvania Railroad. I was offered an interest in the venture, which I gladly accepted. The notice came that my share of the first payment was $217.50. How well I remember the exact sum, but $217.50 were as far beyond my means as if it had been millions. I was earning $50 a month, however, and I had prospects, or at least I always felt that I had. I decided to call on the local banker and boldly ask him to advance the sum upon my interest in the affair. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Why, of course, Andy, you are all right. Go ahead. Here is the money." It is a proud day for a man when he pays his last note, but not to be named in comparison with the day in which he makes his first one and gets a banker to take it. I have tried both, and I know. The cars furnished the subsequent payments by their earnings. I paid my first note from my savings, so much per month, and thus I got my foot upon fortune's ladder. It was easy to climb after that. The mark of a millionaire. "I would like some expression from you," I said to Mr. Carnegie, "in reference to the importance of laying aside money from one's earnings as a young man." "You can have it. There is one sure mark of the coming partner, the future millionaire. His revenues always exceed his expenditures. He begins to save early, almost as soon as he begins to earn. I should say to young men, no matter how little it may be possible to save, save that little. Invest it securely, not necessarily in bonds, but in anything which you have good reason to believe will be profitable. Some rare chance will soon present itself for investment. The little you have saved will prove the basis for an amount of credit utterly surprising to you. Capitalists trust the saving man. For every $100 you can produce as the result of hard-won savings, Midas, in search of a partner, will lend or credit 1,000. For every 1,000, 50,000. It is not capital that your seniors require. It is the man who has proof that he has the business habits which create capital. So it is the first $100 that tell. An oil farm. What, I asked Mr. Carnegie, was the next enterprise with which you identified yourself? In company with several others, I purchased the now famous Story Farm on Oil Creek, Pennsylvania, where a well had been bored and natural oil struck the year before. This proved a very profitable investment. In Triumphant Democracy, Mr. Carnegie has expatiated most fully on this venture, which is so important. "When I first visited this famous well," he says, "the oil was running into the creek, where a few flat-bottomed scows lay filled with it, ready to be floated down the Allegheny River on an agreed-upon day each week, when the creek was flooded by means of a temporary dam. This was the beginning of the natural oil business. We purchased the farm for $40,000, and so small was our faith in the ability of the earth to yield for any considerable time the 100 barrels per day which the property was then producing, that we decided to make a pond capable of holding 100,000 barrels of oil, which we estimated would be worth, when the supply ceased, $1 million. Unfortunately for us, the pond leaked fearfully. Evaporation also caused much loss, but we continued to run oil in to make the losses good day after day, until several 100,000 barrels had gone in this fashion. Our experience with the farm is worth reciting. Its value rose to $5 million. That is, the shares of the company sold in the market upon this basis, and 1 year it paid cash dividends of $1 million upon an investment of $40,000. Iron bridges. Were you satisfied to rest with these enterprises in your hands? I asked. No. Railway bridges were then built almost exclusively out of wood, but the Pennsylvania Railroad had begun to experiment with cast iron. It struck me that the bridge of the future must be of iron, and I organized in Pittsburgh a company for the construction of iron bridges. That was the Keystone Bridge Works. We built the first iron bridge across the Ohio. His entrance of the realm of steel was much too long for Mr. Carnegie to discuss, although he was not unwilling to give information relating to the subject. It appears that he realized the immensity of the steel manufacturing business at once. The Union Iron Mills soon followed as one of the enterprises, and later the famous Edgar Thomson Steel Rail Mill. The last was the outcome of a visit to England in 1868, when Carnegie noticed that English railways were discarding iron for steel rails. The Bessemer process had been then perfected and was making its way in all the iron-producing countries. Carnegie, recognizing that it was destined to revolutionize the iron business, introduced it into his mills and made steel rails with which he was enabled to compete with English manufacturers. Homestead Steel Works. His next enterprise was the purchase of the Homestead Steel Works, his great rival in Pittsburgh. In 1888, he had built or acquired 7 distinct iron and steel works, all of which are now included in the Carnegie Steel Company Limited. All the plants of this great firm are within a radius of 5 miles of Pittsburgh. Probably in no other part of the world can be found such an aggregation of splendidly equipped steel works as those controlled by this association. It now comprises the Homestead Steel Works, the Edgar Thomson Steel Works and Furnaces, the Duquesne Steel Works and Furnaces, all within 2 miles of one another, the Lucy Furnaces, the Keystone Bridge Works, the Upper Union Rolling Mills, and the Lower Union Rolling Mills. In all branches, including the great coke works, mines, etc., there are employed 25,000 men. The monthly payroll exceeds $1,125,000, or nearly $50,000 for each working day. Including the Frick Coke Company, the united capital of the Carnegie Steel Company exceeds $60 million. A strengthening policy. You believe in taking active measures, I said, to make men successful. I believe in anything which will help men to help themselves. To induce them to save, every workman in our company is allowed to deposit part of his earnings, not exceeding $2,000, with the firm, on which the high interest rate of 6% is allowed. The firm also lends to any of its workmen to buy a lot or to buy a house, taking its pay by installments. Has this contributed to the success of your company? I think so. The policy of giving a personal interest to the men who render exceptional service is strengthening. With us there are many such, and every year several more are added as partners. It is the policy of the concern to interest every superintendent in the works, every head of a department, every exceptional young man. Promotion follows exceptional service, and there is no favoritism. Philanthropy. All you have said so far merely gives the idea of getting money, without any suggestion as to the proper use of great wealth. Will you say something on that score? My views are rather well known, I think. What a man owns is already subordinate in America to what he knows, but in the final aristocracy the question will not be either of these, but what has he done for his fellows? Where has he shown generosity and self-abnegation? Where has he been a father to the fatherless? And the cause of the poor, where has he searched that out? That Mr. Carnegie has lived up in the past, and is still living up to this radical declaration of independence from the practice of men who have amassed fortunes around him, will be best shown by a brief enumeration of some of his almost unexampled philanthropies. His largest gift has been to the city of Pittsburgh, the scene of his early trials and later triumphs. There he has built, at a cost of more than $1 million, a magnificent library, museum, concert hall, and picture gallery, all under one roof, and endowed it with a fund of another $1 million, the interest of which, $50,000 per annum, is being devoted to the purchase of the best works of American art. Other libraries, to be connected with this largest as a center, are now being constructed, which will make the city of Pittsburgh and its environs a beneficiary of his generosity to the extent of $5 million. While thus endowing the city where his fortune was made, he has not forgotten other places endeared to him by association or by interest. To the Allegheny Free Library he has given $375,000. To the Braddock Free Library, $250,000. To the Johnstown Free Library, $50,000. And to the Fairfield, Iowa Library, $40,000. To the Cooper Institute, New York, he has given $300,000. To his native land he has been scarcely less generous. To the Edinburgh Free Library he has given $250,000, and to his native town of Dunfermline $90,000. Other Scottish towns, to the number of 10, have received helpful donations of amounts not quite so large. He has given $50,000 to aid poor young men and women to gain a musical education at the Royal College of Music in London. The misfortune of being rich men's sons. I would like to cause you to say some other important things for young men to learn and benefit by. Our young partners in the Carnegie Company have all won their spurs by showing that we did not know half as well what was wanted as they did. Some of them have acted upon occasions with me as if they owned the firm and I was but some airy New Yorker, presuming to advise upon what I knew very little about. Well, they are not now interfered with. They were the true bosses, the very men we were looking for. Is this all for the poor boy? Every word. Those who have the misfortune to be rich men's sons are heavily weighted in the race. A basketful of bonds is the heaviest basket a young man ever had to carry. He generally gets to staggering under it. The vast majority of rich men's sons are enabled to resist the temptations to which wealth subjects them, and they sink to unworthy lives. It is not from this class that the poor beginner has rivalry to fear. The partners' sons will never trouble you much, but look out that some boys, poorer, much poorer than yourselves, whose parents cannot afford to give them any schooling, do not challenge you at the post and pass you at the grandstand. Look out for the boy who has to plunge into work direct from the common school, and begins by sweeping out the office. He is the probable dark horse that will take all the money and win all the applause. Open footnote. Mr. Carnegie's recent retirement from business and the sale of his vast properties to the Morgan Syndicate marks a new era in his remarkable career, and it gives him the more leisure to consider carefully every dollar he bestows in the series of magnificent charities that he has inaugurated. End of footnote. End of chapter 16.
Section 17 of How They Succeeded. How They Succeeded by Orison Swett Marden. John B. Hershoff, the Yacht Builder. 1. The Voyage of Life. Total eclipse, no sun, no moon, darkness amid the blaze of noon. Milton. Amid the ranks of the blind, we often find men and women of culture and general ability, but we do not look for world-renowned specialists. No one is surprised at a display of enterprise in a booming western town, where everybody is hustling, but in a place which has once ranked as the third seaport in America, but has seen its maritime glory decline, a man who can establish a marine industry on a higher plane than was ever before known, and attract to his work such world-wide attention as to restore the vanished fame of his town, is no ordinary person. Moreover, if such a man has laid his plans and done his work in the disheartening eclipse of total blindness, he must possess qualities of the highest order. The office of the Herreshoff Manufacturing Company, at Bristol, Rhode Island, is in a building that formerly belonged to the Burnside Rifle Company. It is substantial, but unpretentious, and is entered by a short stairway on one side. The furniture throughout is also plain, but has been selected with excellent taste, and is suggestive of the most effective adaptation of means to ends in every detail. On the mantel and on the walls are numerous pictures, most of them of vessels, but very few relating directly to any of the great races for the America's Cup. The first picture to arrest one's attention, indeed, is an excellent portrait of the late General Ambrose E. Burnside, who lived in Bristol, and was an intimate friend of John B. Herreshoff. Previous inquiry had elicited the information that the members of the firm are very busy with various large orders, in addition to the rush of work on cup defenders, so it was a very agreeable surprise when I was invited into the tasteful private office where the blind president sat, having just concluded a short conversation with an attorney. "Let the work show." "Well, sir," said he, rising and grasping my hand cordially, "what do you wish?" "I realize how very busy you must be, Mr. Herreshoff," I replied, "and will try to be as brief as possible, but I venture to ask a few minutes of your time to obtain suggestions and advice from you to young people. But why select me in particular as an adviser?" This was a poser at first, especially when he added, noted my hesitation, "We are frequently requested to give interviews in regard to our manufacturing business, but since it is the settled policy of our house to do our work just as well as we possibly can, and then leave it to speak for itself, we have felt obliged to decline all these requests. It would be repugnant to our sense of propriety to talk in public about our special industry. Let the work show seems to us a good motto." The Voyage of Life. "True," said I, "but the readers of my book may not care to read of cutters or skimming dishes, centre boards or fin keels, or copper coils versus steel tubes for boilers. They leave the choice in such matters to you, realizing that you have always proved equal to the situation. What I want now is advice in regard to the race of life, the voyage in which each youth must be his own captain, but in which the words of others who have successfully sailed the sea before will help to avoid rocks and shoals, and to profit by favoring currents and trade winds. You have been handicapped in an unusual degree, sailing in total darkness and beset by many other difficulties, but have, nevertheless, made a very prosperous voyage. In overcoming such serious obstacles, you must have learned much of the true philosophy of both success and failure, and I think you will be willing to help the young with suggestions drawn from your experience." "I always want to help young people, or old people either, for that matter, if anything I can say will do so. But what can I say?" A mother's mighty influence. "What do you call the prime requisite of success?" I have to answer that by a somewhat humorous but very shrewd suggestion of another, select a good mother. Especially for boys, I consider an intelligent, affectionate, but considerate mother an almost indispensable requisite to the highest success. If you would improve the rising generation to the utmost, appeal first to the mothers. "In what way?" "Above all things else, show them that reasonable self-denial is 1,000-fold better for a boy than to have his every wish gratified. Teach them to encourage industry, economy, concentration of attention and purpose, and indomitable persistence." "But most mothers try to do this, don't they?" "Yes, in a measure. But many of them, perhaps most of them, do not emphasize the matter half enough. A mother may wish to teach all these lessons to her son, but she thinks too much of him, or believes she does, to have him suffer any deprivation, and so indulges him in things which are luxuries for him, under the circumstances, rather than necessities. Many a boy, born with ordinary intellect, would follow the example of an industrious father, were it not that his mother wishes him to appear as well as any boy in the neighborhood. So, without exactly meaning it, she gets to making a show of her boy, and brings him up with a habit of idling away valuable time to keep up appearances. The prudent mother, however, sees the folly of this course, and teaches her son to excel in study and work, rather than in vain display. The difference in mothers makes all the difference in the world to children, who, like brooks, can be turned very easily in their course of life. Self-help. What ranks next in importance? Boys and girls themselves, especially as they grow older, and have a chance to understand what life means, should not only help their parents as a matter of duty, but should learn to help themselves for their own good. I would not have them forego recreation, a reasonable amount every day, but let them learn the reality and earnestness of existence, and resolve to do the whole work and the very best work of thorough, reliable young men and women. What career? What would you advise as to choosing a career? In that I should be governed largely by the bent of each youth. What he likes to do best of all, that he should do, and he should try to do it better than anyone else. That is legitimate emulation. Let him devote his full energy to his work, with the provision, however, that he needs change or recreation more in proportion as he uses his brain more. The more muscular the work, if not too heavy, the more hours is a good rule. The more brain work, the fewer hours. Children at school should not be expected to work so long or so hard as if engaged in manual labor. Temperament, too, should be considered. A highly organized, nervous person, like a racehorse, may display intense activity for a short time, but it should be followed by a long period of rest, while the phlegmatic person, like the ox or the draught horse, can go all day without injury. Education. I believe in education most thoroughly, and think no one can have too much knowledge if properly digested. But in many of our colleges, I have often thought, not more than 1 in 5 is radically improved by the course. Most collegiates waste too much time in frivolity, and somehow there seems to be little restraining power in the college to prevent this. I agree that students should have self-restraint and application themselves, but in the absence of these, the college should supply more compulsion than is now the rule. Apprentices. Do you favor reviving the old apprentice system for would-be mechanics? Only in rare cases. As a rule, we have special machines now that do as perfect work as the market requires. Some of them, indeed, better work than can be done by hand. A boy or man can soon learn to tend one of these, when he becomes, for ordinary purposes, a specialist. Very few shops now have apprentices. No rule, however, will apply to all, and it may still be best for one to serve an apprenticeship in a trade in which he wishes to advance beyond any predecessor or competitor. Prepare to the utmost, then do your best. Is success dependent more upon ability or opportunity? Of course, opportunity is necessary. You couldn't run a mammoth department store in the desert of Sahara. But given the possibility, the right man can make his opportunity, and should do so if it is not at hand, or does not come after reasonable waiting. Even Napoleon had to wait for his. On the other hand, if there is no ability, none can display itself, and the best opportunity must pass by unimproved. The true way is to first develop your ability to the last ounce, and then you will be ready for your opportunity, when it comes, or to make one if none offers. Present opportunities. Is the chance for a youth as good as it was 25 or 50 years ago? Yes and no. In any country, as it becomes more thickly populated, the chance for purely individual enterprises is almost sure to diminish. One notices this more as he travels through other and older countries, where, far more than with us, boys follow in the footsteps of their fathers, generation after generation. But for those who are willing to adapt themselves to circumstances, the chance today, at least from a pecuniary standpoint, is better than ever before, for those starting in life. There was doubtless more chance for the individual boat builder in the days of King Philip, when each Indian made his own canoe, but there is certainly more profit now for an employee of our firm of boat builders. Natural executive ability. Granted, however, that he can find employment, how do his chances of rising compare with those of your youth? They still depend largely upon the individual. Some seem to have natural executive ability, and others develop it, while most men never possess it. those who lack it cannot hope to rise far, and never could. Jefferson's idea that all men are created equal is true enough, perhaps, so far as their political rights are concerned, but from the point of view of efficiency in business it is ridiculous. In any shop of 100 men, you will find one who is acknowledged, at least tacitly, as the leader, and he sooner or later becomes so in fact. A rich boy may get and hold a place in an office on account of his wealth or influence, but in the works, merit alone will enable a man to hold a place long. The development of power. But what is his chance of becoming a proprietor? That is smaller, of course, as establishments grow larger and more valuable. It is all bosh for every man to expect to become a Vanderbilt or a Rockefeller or to be president. But in the long run, a man will still rise and prosper in almost exact proportion to his real value to the business world. He will rise or fall according to his ability. Can he develop ability? Yes, to a certain extent. As I have said, we are not all alike, and no amount of cultivation will make some minds equal to those of others who have had but little training. But, whether great or small, everyone has some weak point. Let him first study to overcome that. How can he do that? The only way I know of is to do it. But this brings me back to what I told you at first. A good mother will show one how to guard against his weak points. She should study each child and develop his individual character, for character is the true foundation, after all. She should check extravagance and encourage industry and self-respect. My mother is one of the best, and I feel I owe her a debt I can never repay. My mother. Your mother? Why, I thought you had been a boat builder for half a century. How old is she? She is 88, and still enjoys good health. If I have one thing more than another to be thankful for, it is her care in childhood and her advice and sympathy through life. How often have I thought of her wisdom when I have seen mothers from Europe, where they were satisfied to be peasants, seek to outshine all their neighbors after they have been in America a few years, and so bring financial ruin to their husbands, or even goad them into crime, and curse their children with contempt for honest labor in positions for which they are fitted, and a foolish desire to keep up appearances, even by living beyond their means, and by seeking positions they cannot fill properly. A boat builder in youth. You must have been quite young when you began to build boats. About 13 or 14 years old. You see, my father was an amateur boat builder, in a small way, and did very good work, but usually not for sale. But I began the work as a business 36 years ago, when I was about 22. He would not be discouraged. You must have been terribly handicapped by your blindness. It was an obstacle, but I simply would not allow it to discourage me, and I did my best just the same as if I could see. My mother had taught me to think, and so I made thought and memory take the place of eyes. I acquired a kind of habit of mental projection which has enabled me to see models in my mind, as it were, and to consider their good and bad points intelligently. Besides, I cultivated my powers of observation to the utmost in other respects. Even now I take an occasional trip of observation, for I like to see what others are doing, and so keep abreast of the progress of the age. But I must stop, or I shall get to talking shop, the thing I declined to do at first. The sum of it all. The main thing for a boy is to have a good mother, to heed her advice, to do his best, and to not get a swelled head as he rises. In other words, not to expect to put a gallon into a pint cup, or a bushel into a peck measure. Concentration, decision, industry, and economy should be his watchwords, and invincible determination and persistence his rule of action. With another cordial handshake, he bade me good-bye. 2. What the Herreshoff brothers have been doing. Their recent cup defenders have made their names familiar to all, but shipping circles have long known them. The business of the firm was long confined almost wholly to the creation of boats with single masts, each craft from 20 to 36 feet long. In their first 10 years of associated work, they built nearly 2,000 of these. But they were wonderful little boats, and of unrivaled swiftness. Then they made as wonderful a success in building steam fishing yachts. Then came torpedo boats. And in 1881 their proposal to the British government to build 2 vedette boats was accepted on condition they should outmatch the works of White, the naval launch builder at Cowes. No firm had ever been able to compete with White, but in the following July the 2 Herreshoff boats were in the Portsmouth dockyard, England, ready for trial. They were each 48 feet long, 9 feet in beam, and 5 feet deep, exactly the same size as White's. They made 15 1/2 knots an hour, while White's only recorded 12 2/5 knots. With all their machinery, coal and water in place, the Herreshoff boats were filled with water, and then 20 men were put aboard each, that human load being just so much in excess the Admiralty test, and even then each had a floating capacity of 3 tons. The examiners pronounced enthusiastically in favor of the Herreshoff safety coil boilers as unexplodable, less liable to injury from shock, capable of raising steam more quickly, far lighter, and in all respects superior to those that had been formerly used for the purpose. The boats were accepted, and orders given at once for 2 pinnaces, each 33 feet long. Again John Samuel White competed, but his new boats could only make 7 1/8 knots, while the Herreshoffs easily scored 9 1/4. Racing Jay Gould. In July 1883, Jay Gould was highly elated over the speed of his beautiful steam yacht Atalanta, which had several times met and distanced Edward S. Jaffray's wonderful Stranger. But on the 20th of that month his happiness, as the story is told, was very suddenly dashed. After a hard day's work, the jaded Jay boarded the Atalanta and began to shake out his pin feathers a little, figuratively speaking. But before his boat had gone far on her run to Irvington, the bold manipulator of Wall Street made out a craft on his weather quarter that seemed to be gliding after the Atalanta with intent to overhaul her. He had a good start, however, and sang out to the captain to keep a sharp eye on the persistent little stranger, so unlike the stranger he had vanquished. "I wonder what it is," he exclaimed to a friend beside him. The friend looked long and carefully at the oncoming boat, then turned a quizzical eye on Jay, remarking, "In a little while we can tell." "Will she get that close?" "I think she will." It was not long before the strange boat was abreast of the Atalanta, and Jay was then able to make out the mystical number 100 on her. He rubbed his eyes. Those were the very figures he had long hoped to see on the stock ticker, after the words Western Union, but that day they had lost their charm. Before long he was not only able to see the broadside of the 100, but also had a good view of the stern of the vessel, whereon the same figures soon appeared, and nearly as soon disappeared, as the 100 bade good-bye to the Atalanta, which was burning every pound of coal that could possibly be carried without putting Mr. Gould or some efficient substitute on the safety valve. "He seems to be out of humour to-night," said his coachman, after leaving his employer at the door of his Irvington mansion. The mystic 100, which, by the way, was just 100 feet over all, was merely the 100th steamer built by the Herreshoffs, but on her first trip up the Hudson she attracted as much attention as the Half Moon of Henry Hudson or the Claremont of Robert Fulton. She was the fastest yacht in the world, and was beaten on the river only by one vessel, the Mary Powell, 4 1/2 minutes in 20 miles. Although Mr. Gould was considerably irritated at his defeat, he knew a good thing when he saw it, and the next year he ordered a small steam launch of the Herreshoffs. The 100 made a great stir in Boston harbor. Later on she steamed through the Erie Canal and the Great Lakes, and made her home with the millionaire Mark Hopkins. The Stiletto. The versatility of the Herreshoffs has appeared in their famous boiler improvement, and in the great variety of vessels they have built. The Stiletto, only 94 feet long over all, astonished the yachting world of 1885. On June 10 she beat the Mary Powell 2 miles in a race of 28 miles on the Hudson. At one time the Stiletto circled completely around the big steamer and then moved rapidly away from her. Secretary Whitney bought the Stiletto for the United States Navy, in which she has done valuable service. She was followed, in 1890, by the still faster Cushing, whose record in the recent Spanish-American War is so well known. Admiral Porter wrote to Secretary of the Navy Chandler that the little Herreshoff steam launches were faster than any other owned by the government, their great superiority showing especially against a strong headwind and sea, where they would remain dry while their rivals required constant bailing. They were better trimmed, lighter, more buoyant, and in every way superior in nautical qualities, and twice as fast as others in a gale. 19 vessels have been built by this firm for the United States government. "There is a certain speed that attaches to every vessel, which may be called its natural rate," says Louis Herreshoff. "It is mainly governed by its length and the length of the carrier wave which always accompanies a vessel parallel to her line of motion. When she reaches a speed great enough to form a wave of the same length as the moving body, then that vessel has reached her natural rate of speed, and all that can be obtained above that is done by sheer brute force. The natural limit of speed of a boat 40 feet long is about 10 miles an hour, of a vessel 60 feet in length, 12 1/4 miles, of one 100 feet long, 15 3/4 miles, of one 200 feet long, 22 miles. As the speed is increased, this double or carrier wave, one half on either side of the yacht, lengthens in such a way that the vessel seems to settle more the faster she goes, and so has to climb the very wave she makes. Hence the motive power must be increased much faster than the speed increases. Further, in order to avoid this settling and consequent climbing as much as possible, lightness of construction, next to correct proportions, is made the great desideratum in the Herreshoff's ideal boat. They use wood whenever possible, as it is not only lighter than metal, but is reasonably strong and generally much more durable. Wherever heavy strains come, a bracing form of construction is adopted, and metal is used also. The engine of the stiletto weighs 10 pounds for each indicated horsepower, that of the Cushing 15. The entire motive plant of the Cushing weighs 65 pounds for each horsepower, that of the city of Paris 200. Comparing displacement, the former has 8 times the power of the latter. For 4 years our government kept a staff of officers stationed at the Herreshoff works to experiment with high-speed machinery, in which the firm then led the country. One of their steamers, ascending the St. Lawrence River to the Thousand Islands, ran up all the rapids except the Lachine, where a detour by canal was made. The Canadians were deeply impressed by this triumph. The Blind Brothers. One of the Herreshoff sisters is blind, and a remarkable musician, and one brother blind who studied music in Berlin, and who conducts a school of music in Providence. Louis Herreshoff, one of the boat builders, is also blind. He, too, is a fine musician and an excellent bass singer, having received careful vocal training in Europe. He has fine literary taste, a very clear style, and writes for magazines, especially on boat building and engineering. He has a large foreign correspondence, all of which he answers personally on the typewriter. It would be difficult to find a greater favorite with young people, to whom he devotes much of his time, teaching them games or lessons, also how to sail or row a boat, how to swim or float, and how to save each other from drowning. When walking along the street with a group of chatting children, he will ask, "What time is it by the clock on St. Michael's Church?" pointing right at the steeple. He will wind a clock and set it exactly, and regulate it if it does not go right. The personality of John B. Herreshoff. From his boyhood, John B. Herreshoff evinced a great fondness for boats and machinery, finding most pleasure, in his leisure hours, when boys of his age usually think only of play, in haunting boat builders' yards and machine shops, studying how and why things were done, and reading what had been done elsewhere in those branches of industry beyond his field of observation. At the age of 11 he was studying the best lines for vessels' hulls, and making models, and 3 years later he began building boats. His terrible affliction has never seemed to weaken his self-reliance or turn him aside from following the chosen pursuit of his life, but has rather strengthened his devotion to it and his capacity for it by concentrating all his faculties upon it. His many years of blindness have given him not only the serious, patient, introspective look common to those who suffer like him, and their gentle, clearly modulated voice, but have also developed all his other faculties to such an extent as to largely replace the missing sense. He can tell as much about an ordinary-sized steam launch, her lines, method of construction, etc., by feeling, as others can by seeing, and he goes on inventing and building just as if his eyes were not closed forever. He is a tall, big-brained man, who couldn't help inventing and working if he tried. Such a man would have to suffer the loss of more than one of his senses before his mental efficiency would be impaired. When he wanted to build some steam launches for the government, he went to the Navy Yard at Washington, and felt of the government launches, to discover their shape and how they were made. Then he went to Bristol, and made better launches suitable for the government's use. Has he a sixth sense? He reads and understands the most delicate intonations and modulations of voices addressing him, as others read and understand facial expression. His sensitive fingers detect differences in metals, and follow, as if with a gift of perception, the lines of models submitted to him, and his mind sees even more clearly than by mere physical sight the intricacies of the most complicated machinery intelligently described to him, or over which his fingers are allowed to move. "That is a good stick," he will say, examining a pile of lumber with his fingers. "Here's a shaky piece, throw it out. It won't do for this work. May come next." Or, "Saw off this end, is poor stock. The rest is all right." On hearing him criticize, direct, and explain things within his province, a stranger finds it hard to believe he cannot see at least a little out of one eye. Seeing with the fingers. By the constant practice he has, as he expresses it, learned to see with his hands, not quite so quickly, but he believes as perfectly, as he could with his eyes, and this means more than it does in the case of an ordinary blind man, for by a touch he can tell whether the graceful double curves of a boat's bottom are in correct proportion, one with another, and then, by a few rapid sweeps of his hands over all, he can instantly judge of the symmetry and perfection of the whole. Even more than this, he will give minute directions to the carpenters and mechanics. Running his hand along the piece of work one had produced, will immediately detect the slightest deviation from the instruction he has given. If at all impatient, he will seize the plane or another tool, and do the work himself. And yet the world calls this man blind. While skill plays a material part, one of John B. Herreshoff's boats is a product of the mind, in a very great degree. Psychologists tell us that we do not see with our eyes, but with the brain proper. This blind man sees and constructs, not that which is objective and real to others, but that which is evolved from a transcendental intelligence applied to the most practical purposes. Brother Nat. One of the brothers, who has good eyes, is a prominent chemist in New York, and one who can see is Nat, the designer for the boat building. Nathaniel G., the great yacht designer, was born in 1848. When he was not more than 2 years old, he was often found asleep on the sand along shore, with the rising tide washing his bare feet. Whenever he was missing, he was sought for first on the shore, where he would generally be found watching the ships or playing with toy boats. At 9 years of age he was an excellent helmsman, and at 12 he sailed the Sprite to her first victory and won a prize. When older grown, he was known as a vigilant watcher of every chance as well as a skilful sailor. Once, when steering the Ianthe into a failing wind, he veered widely from a crowd of contestants so as to run into a good breeze he noted far to starboard, and won the race. He took a 4 years' course at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and then served an apprenticeship with the famous Corliss Engine Company. He worked on the great engine of the Centennial Exposition, and took a course of engineering abroad, visiting many noted shipyards. He joined the firm in 1877, 14 years after the works were opened. Nathaniel Green Herreshoff, named for the General Green of Revolutionary fame, is 7 years younger, and only less famous than his blind brother as a boat builder, only second to John B. in about the same way that Green was second to Washington. "General Green is second to no one," said Washington. John B. would have done splendid work without Nat, as he did for years before the latter joined the firm, but it would have been in a smaller way. For years John B., his father, and his brothers James B. or Lewis, and Nathaniel G., were accustomed to get together frequently in the dining room of the old homestead, and talk and plan together in regard to boat building. Nat would usually make the first model on lines previously agreed upon, and then John B. would feel it all over and suggest changes, which would be made, and the consultation continued until all was satisfactory. Nathaniel is described as a tall, thin man, with a full beard and stoop, the latter said to have been acquired in watching his rivals in his races, craning his head in order to see them from under the boom. "We have been always together from boyhood," said John B., speaking of Nat. "We have had the same pleasures, the same purposes, the same aspirations. In fact, we have almost been one, and we have achieved nothing for which a full share of credit is not his just due. Nothing has ever been done by one without the other. Whenever one found an obstacle or difficulty, the other helped him to remove it, and he, being without the disadvantage I have, never makes a mistake." End of section 17.
Chapter 18 of How They Succeeded. How They Succeeded by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 18. A Successful Novelist, Fame After 50. Practical Hints to Young Authors by Mrs. Amelia E. Barr. To be successful, that is the legitimate ideal every true worker seeks to realise. To be successful, that is the legitimate ideal every true worker seeks to realise. But success is not the open secret which it appears to be. Its elements are often uncomprehended, and its roots generally go deep down, into the very beginnings of life. I can compel my soul to look back into that twilight which shrouds my earliest years, and perceive even in them monitions and tendencies working for that future, which in my destiny was fashioned and shaped when as yet there was neither hint nor dream of it. Fortunately, I had parents who understood the value of biblical and imaginative literature in the formation of the intellect. The men and women whom I knew first and best were those of the Hebrew world, sitting before the nursery fire while the snow fell softly and ceaselessly, and all the mountains round were white, and the streets of the little English town choked with drifts. I could see the camels and the caravans of the Ishmaelitish merchants passing through the hot sandy desert. I could see Hagar weeping under the palm, and the waters of the Red Sea standing up like a wall, Miriam clashing the timbrels, and Deborah singing under the oak, and Ruth gleaning in the wheat fields of Bethlehem, were as real to me as were the women of my own home. Before I was 6 years old, I had been with Christian to the Celestial City, and had watched with Crusoe the mysterious footprint on the sand, and the advent of the savages. Then came the wonders of Afrites and Genii, and all the marvels and miracles of the Arabian tales. These were the mind builders, and though schools and teachers and textbooks did much afterwards, I can never nor will forget the glorious company of men and women from the sacred world, and that marvellous company of caliphs and kings and princesses from wonderland and fairyland, that expanded my whole nature, and fitted me for the future miracles of nature and science, and all the marvellous people of the poet's realm. Footnote: this is a most remarkable story, communicated to me by Mrs. Barr, and related for the first time in this article. The distinguished novelist being a perfect housekeeper and the mother of a large family, yet earns $20,000 a year by her books, which have been translated into the language of almost every civilized country. OSM. End of footnote. For 18 years I was amassing facts and fancies, developing a crude intelligence, waiting for the vitalization of the heart. Then love, the supreme teacher, came, and his first lesson was renunciation. I was to give up father and mother, home and kindred, friends and country, and follow where he would lead me, into a land strange and far off. Childbearing and child-losing, the limitations and delights of frontier life, the intimate society of such great and individual men as Sam Houston, and the men who fought with him, the intense feelings induced by war, its uncertainties and possibilities, and the awful abiding in the valley of the shadow of death, with the pestilence that walked in darkness and the sickness that destroyed at noonday. All these events, with their inevitable asides, were instrumental in the education and preparation of the 17 years of my married life. A calamitous lesson of widowhood, under peculiarly tragic circumstances, was the last initiation of a heart already broken and humbled before him who doeth all things well, no matter how hard the stroke may be. I thought all was over then, yet all was just beginning. It was the open door to a new life, a life full of comforts and serene, still, delightful studies. Though I had written stories to please my children, and many things to please myself, it had never occurred to me that money could be made by writing. The late William Libby, a man of singular wisdom and kindness, first made me understand that my brain and my 10 fingers were security for a good living. From my first effort I began to gather in the harvest of all my years of study and reading and private writing. For there is this peculiarity about writing, that if in any direction it has merit, it will certainly find a market. For 15 years I wrote short stories, poems, editorials, and articles on every conceivable subject, from Herbert Spencer's theories to gentlemen's walking sticks, but bringing to every piece of work, if it was only 10 lines, the best of my knowledge and ability, and so earning, with a great deal of pleasure, a very good living. During the earlier years of this time, I worked and read on an average 15 hours a day, for I knew that to make good work I must have constant fresh material, must keep up to date in style and method, and must therefore read far more than I wrote. But I have been an omnivorous reader all my life long, and no changes, no cares of home and children have ever interfered with this mental necessity. In the most unlikely places and circumstances I looked for books and found them. These 15 years on the weekly and monthly periodicals gave me the widest opportunities for information. I had an alcove in the Astor Library, and I practically lived in it. I slept and ate at home, but I lived in that city of books. I was in the prime of life, but neither society, amusements, nor pleasures of any kind could draw me away from the source of all my happiness and profit. Suddenly, after this long novitiate, I received the call for a different work. I had an accident which confined me to my room, and which I knew would keep me from active work for some months. I fretted for my work, as dry wood frets an inch from the flame, and said, I shall lose all I have gained. I shall fall behind in the race. All these things are against me. They were all for me. A little story of what seemed exceptional merit had been laid away in the hope that I might some day find time to extend it into a novel. A prisoner in my chair, I finished the book in 6 weeks, and sent it to Dodd, Mead and Company. On Thanksgiving morning a letter came, accepting the book, and any of my readers can imagine what a happy Thanksgiving day that was. This book was Jan Vedder's Wife, and its great and immediate success indicated to me the work I was at length ready for. I was in my 52nd year, and every year had been a preparation for the work I have since pursued. I went out from that sick room sure of my vocation, and with a confidence founded on the certainty of my equipment, and a determination to trust humanity, and take my readers only into green pastures and ways of purity and heroism, I ventured on my new path as a novelist. I cannot close this paper without a few words to those who wish to profit by it. I want them to be sure of a few points which in my narrative I may not have emphasised sufficiently. Words of counsel. 1. Men and women succeed because they take pains to succeed. Industry and patience are almost genius, and successful people are often more distinguished for resolution and perseverance than for unusual gifts. They make determination and unity of purpose supply the place of ability. 2. Success is the reward of those who spurn delights and live laborious days. We learn to do things by doing them. One of the great secrets of success is pegging away. No disappointment must discourage, and a run back must often be allowed in order to take a longer leap forward. 3. No opposition must be taken to heart. Our enemies often help us more than our friends. Besides, a headwind is better than no wind. Whoever got anywhere in a dead calm? 4. A fatal mistake is to imagine that success is some stroke of luck. This world is run with far too tight a rein for luck to interfere. Fortune sells her wares, she never gives them. In some form or other, we pay for her favours, or we go empty away. 5. We have been told for centuries to watch for opportunities, and to strike while the iron is hot. Very good. But I think better of Oliver Cromwell's amendment. Make the iron hot by striking it. 6. Everything good needs time. Don't do work in a hurry. Go into details. It pays in every way. Time means power for your work. Mediocrity is always in a rush. But whatever is worth doing at all is worth doing with consideration. For genius is nothing more nor less than doing well what anyone can do badly. 7. Be orderly. Slatternly work is never good work. It is either affectation or there is some radical defect in the intellect. I would distrust even the spiritual life of one whose methods and work were dirty, untidy, and without clearness and order. 8. Never be above your profession. I have had many letters from people who wanted all the emoluments and honours of literature, and who yet said, literature is the accident of my life. I am a lawyer, or a doctor, or a lady, or a gentleman. Literature is no accident. She is a mistress who demands the whole heart, the whole intellect, and the whole time of a devotee. 9. Don't fail through defects of temper and oversensitiveness at moments of trial. One of the great helps to success is to be cheerful, to go to work with a full sense of life, to be determined to put hindrances out of the way, to prevail over them and to get the mastery. Above all things else, be cheerful. There is no beatitude for the despairing. Apparent success may be reached by sheer impudence, in defiance of offensive demerit, but men who get what they are manifestly unfit for are made to feel what people think of them. Charlantry may flourish, but when its bay tree is greenest, it is held far lower than genuine effort. The world is just. It does, patronise quacks, but it never puts them on a level with true men. It is better to have the opportunity of victory than to be spared the struggle, for success comes as the result of arduous experience. The foundations of my success were laid before I can well remember. It was after at least 45 years of conscious labour that I reached the object of my hope. Many a time my head failed me, my hands failed me, and my feet failed me. But thank God, my heart never failed me, because I knew that no extremity would find God's arm shortened. End of chapter 18.